a talk about a book written about Joshua Heschel. So she's going to announce it today. About the email. Yeah, that's true. Because there's a link that you can get to listen to the lecture. It's on Wednesday.
I'll email it out.
Yeah.
Okay,
You'll
great.
email it, yeah.
Jennifer's true. She'll take care of it.
Okay, yeah. And I don't have your email address, but I just responded to that.
My email address, just for future reference, is rabbidan@aol.com.
Okay,
And
okay.
that's the reason I keep it, because I can't get Rabbi Dan.
Is that with a capital R?
RABBIDANNY.
Yeah, at AOL.com. Because I got up. Yeah, so we'll come over at 2:30. Yeah. Oh, I don't know, but I saw that. Yeah, because when I looked at the actual.
Okay.
Schedule.
Well, Jennifer,
Yeah.
no, it won't get taken. It just, I don't think they, it's not me. I mean, I would love for it to be live stream, but they can't quite figure out how to do it.
That's a different policy.
We have machinery in other rooms, but you can't really have a classroom in the chapel or in the freedom level, you know, it just. It's not a classroom. You can't have a conversation. The sound, it does, the sound in those rooms makes it more difficult to have a conversation. And the only way you can do it is if you had 20 seats and a table up on the beach. Okay, Jennifer, are we ready? All right, let's, everybody, we have the sign up sheet going around. Make sure everybody signs in. We want to make sure that we know that you were here. Yeah. So I wanted to share with you just a short piece, but before we go back into the prophets, I want to show you a short piece from a book. It's a really interesting book by an Arab Catholic named Sohrab Ahmari. And the book is called The Unbroken Thread, Discovering the Wisdom of Tradition in an Age of Chaos. And one of the people he talks about in there is Heschel. Okay? Here, and I just want to read a short portion of this for you. He said, Heschel is today best remembered for his 1960s activism in the United States. He marched arm in arm with Martin Luther King Jr., was the only Jew to eulogize King at King's funeral. He also emerged as Vatican II's leading Jewish interlocutor, helping shape the Council's interfaith declaration, which definitively clarified that Jews didn't bear collective guilt for Jesus' death. He spent his final years fiercely opposing the Vietnam War. Yet it would be a category mistake to class Heschel among those religious thinkers who reduced the teachings of the Bible to a vague and loose progressive ethic. On the contrary, Heschel was a loud critic of such readings. He railed against those who would minimize prayer and turn houses of worship into community centers. He likewise rejected the treatment of the biblical God and of biblical prayer as symbols of social action. In opposition to such trends, Heschel spoke of a God who really exists, who discloses himself to men and women, and who demands a response foremost in piety. Okay? And Heschel's lifelong hatred of injustice, be it the unspeakable mass murder of the Holocaust or the discomforting sight of a black man polishing a white man's shoes, the first thing he saw after arriving in New York Harbor, was an outpouring of this piety. Okay? Before Heschel ever denounced the racial and class injustices that disfigured the land that gave him refuge, he denounced the commercialized and technocratic way of life that denied time to the Sabbath. Indeed, he believed that the two deplorable phenomena were bound up with each other. The cycle had to be broken, and only the Sabbath had the power to do that. So, in short,
Who's the author again?
Sohrab Ahmari. Yeah.
Can I see this?
Yeah, sure. I'll just, you can just pass it around, make sure I get it back, because the library has to get it back.
What was the reason he wrote this book?
He wrote this book because he feels that everybody is running around making money and has no respect for the traditions that give meaning to life aside from making money. Right? That's why.
But isn't that the American way?
Well, he says that's a problem. Heschel said that's a problem.
Oh, I know, I understand.
Okay, so, yeah. The answer is yes, but how do you respond to it? Okay, do you buy into it? Do you accept it? Or do you resist it? Okay. So let me turn to Heschel in one of his teachings in the chapter about justice. So he says, thank you. Yeah, good. Israel was the vineyard that the Lord had planted. He looked for it to yield grapes, but it yielded wild grapes. He looked for it to yield justice, but it yielded perversion of justice. For righteousness, but it yielded outrage. The prophets consistently singled out the leaders, the kings, the princes, the false prophets, and the priests as the ones responsible for the sins of the community. Right? So, when things are going wrong, the leadership has to take a stand. If the leadership doesn't stand against injustice, then they're guilty, they're responsible, right? And he quotes Isaiah chapter 3, this is verses 14 through 15. The Lord enters into judgment with the elders and princes of his people. It is you who have devoured the vineyard. The spoil of the poor is in your houses. What do you mean by crushing the people, by grinding the face of the poor, says the Lord of hosts. Right? Now, Isaiah has a lot to say about other nations besides Judea, and he makes the point frequently that no nation can protect itself from divine judgment, but certainly the Jews, the Israelites, should not expect to get away with anything. Question, comment? Oh, this was on page 203 in the one volume version.
Paperback is at 259.
Okay. It's very difficult to switch between the two. If I give pages, it may not be the same in the other version. Okay. So one of the most, did somebody had a question? Okay. So one of the most famous passages in Isaiah is called the Isaiah Apocalypse. And you find it in chapters 24 through 27, where it says that God's final judgment will include the whole earth. So let me just read the very beginning of it to you. Right? Behold, the Lord will strip the earth bare and lay it waste and twist its surface and scatter its inhabitants. Layman and priest shall fare alike, slave and master. Pages don't turn very easily. Handmaid and mistress, buyer and seller, lender and borrower, creditor and debtor. The earth shall be bare, bare. It shall be plundered, plundered. For it is the Lord who spoke this word. Oh, yeah. So, but the point again is
Chapter
God,
again, please, Rabbi.
that's chapter 24, right at the beginning, right? That God's final judgment is going to include the entire earth. So,
I've got a question about that.
yes,
So if what he's prophesizing, God had made a promise to Noah that he would never destroy the world again.
With the flood.
With the, only with the flood?
no. Isaiah is not saying that God will destroy the whole world. Isaiah is saying God will exact punishment on the nation that is unjust.
That particular.
It's not destroying the world, it's just going to destroy your world, right? So, yeah, it just feels like that. And here's what Heschel has to say about this. This is 172 in the one volume. Dislike for the world or disparagement of civilization is alien to the prophet. His attachment to God calls upon him to be involved with humanity. Yet in the face of idle and false impositions, he announces the contingency and insecurity of civilization. In other words, civilizations will come and go. The sickness and liability of man. In other words, you're guilty and you're wrong. Israel is under judgment. The covenant with God must not be taken as immunity from judgment. In other words, a lot of people felt like, we have a covenant with God and God is going to protect us no matter what we do. But that's a misreading of the covenant. Right? So, God created the heavens and the earth so easily, and God can uncreate them too. Right? It's like the old joke about the mom who says to her errant son, I brought you into this world and I can take you out of it too. But of
That's
course,
in the Bible, you do that.
I'm sorry?
There's a place in the Torah that says for punishment, if your children disgrace you, you're allowed to kill them.
Yeah, well, the rabbis sort of read that out. They said,
It's actually a law.
Yeah, that the rabbis took passages like that and said, no, we're not doing
A
that.
metaphor.
Yeah, right, yeah, Jerry.
So is it a midrash where they said when the Mashiach comes, he's gonna tell us what's gonna happen afterwards, right? He's gonna identify.
Not only that,
He's gonna identify who you are, all the nations, and right?
The Messiah is going to make it happen.
He's gonna make it happen. He's not gonna destroy the world.
Right.
But he's gonna identify who you were, what you did.
Yes, and if
All
you
the
were one of the
nations,
guilty parties, then
You're in trouble.
you're in trouble.
Right.
Yeah, okay. So, but this is, this whole destruction line of thinking, right? That isn't what God wants. God wants the people to trust God. When Judea will be protected from its enemies and enjoy having peace. This is a very God-centered view of history. This is not how we usually learn history, right? Usually we look at geopolitics, right? Whatever that is. Buber called this theopolitics. Right? But if you're the king, if you're the person who's calling the shots and making the decisions to help protect your entire nation, what are you supposed to do? I mean, it feels like a withdrawing from politics to say, I'm going to, just listen to God and do what the prophet says. One author puts it this way: pretend that you are Churchill and Roosevelt during World War II, and you have to decide, will we go into an alliance with Stalin? Do you turn to God for help, Or do you hold your nose knowing that Stalin is no angel, right? Because you also know that you can't beat the Nazis without such an alliance. What do? Well, that's what Churchill and Roosevelt did. They knew that. So geopolitics and theopolitics don't always mesh very well.
I was just gonna say, maybe if they had turned to God, God would have come up with the same solution.
Right, maybe, right? Maybe they prayed and that's what they came up with.
Yeah,
But
But the enemy, my enemy is my friend.
yes. And so, Stalin became, good old Joe.
For what it's worth, I
Until
think
the war
part of
was
the
over.
motivation had to do with controlling the Soviet Union after the war.
yeah.
Well, that was at best a secondary motivation. The motivation was, we have to beat the Nazis.
Yeah.
Because if we don't, we won't beat them. Right? Okay, so we talked about the first three kings that Isaiah lived with in his career. And now we come to the fourth king in Isaiah's career, and that is King Hezekiah. 2 Kings chapter 18 tells us that Hezekiah trusted God and found favor with God. He is also, however, a very practical king. He made weapons. He repaired the city walls. He built a tunnel to carry water into the city so that if there was a siege, there'd be plenty of water. But he is also worried about Syria. So he's thinking about joining an alliance with Egypt. Isaiah thinks that is a really bad idea, right? God took us out of Egypt. You want to have you have a covenant with God and you want to enter into one with Egypt? That's not going to work. How's that going to work out?
We're doing it today.
Okay, yeah. So, let me show you what he says at the beginning of chapter 30 in Isaiah. Okay. He says, "O disloyal sons, declares the Lord." That's what it gives you the idea where we're going here. "Making plans against my wishes, weaving schemes against my will, thereby piling guilt on guilt. Who set out to go down to Egypt without asking me, to seek refuge with Pharaoh, to seek shelter under the protection of Egypt. The refuge with Pharaoh shall result in your shame, the shelter under Egypt's protection in your chagrin." Okay. Trust horses and chariots? Well, horses are flesh, not spirit. Okay. And so chapter 31:3 says, "The Egyptians are man, not God, and their horses are flesh, not spirit. And when the Lord stretches out his arm, the helper shall trip, and the helped one shall fall, and both shall perish together." Okay. That's pretty clear, isn't it? Modern commentaries compare this to relying on tanks and on planes and so forth. 31 verse 8, "Then Assyria shall fall not by the sword of man, a sword not of humans shall devour him. He shall shrivel before the sword, and his young men pine away," etc. Right? So if Assyria falls, it will not be by human action. Instead, Isaiah gives Hezekiah the same kind of advice that he gave Ahaz. This is chapter 30, verse 15. "For thus said my Lord God, the Holy One of Israel, you shall triumph by stillness and quiet. Your victory shall come about through calm and confidence, but you refused." You refused. You didn't want to, have God on your team. Okay? Isaiah says, "Be calm. God will protect you." And here I think it's appropriate to quote one of the other prophets, one of the later prophets, Zechariah, a passage I suspect most of you are familiar with. Not by might, nor by power, but by my spirit, says the Lord of hosts. Now that sounds great. I mean, that's really holy, okay? But if you're the king, how long do you want to trust in God's spirit? And do you really have faith that it will work?
Very naive.
It sounds very naive. Okay, so, again, what is Isaiah's view of history? Let me pick out a passage from Heschel on page 82, where he describes this. He says, there is a shift of emphasis from pathos as an emotion to pathos in action. Pathos is spoken of in Isaiah more frequently in an instrumental than in a personal sense. An important element in his thinking is the conception that the world's great powers are instruments of the divine will, not the elements of nature, but primarily the powers of history carry out the designs of God. Hey, talks about how Isaiah quotes, Assyria, the rod of my anger. You ever heard that one? The rod of my anger, right? In other words, Assyria is fulfilling God's task for it, even though it's not exactly God's people, right? So once we get through this business with Assyria, then Jerusalem will lead the world, will be an example for everyone. The prophets do not see nature as a force of its own, but the powers of history. Well, Assyria can be an instrument of God. And yes, there are evil agents pursuing their own goals, but they may be the ones who produce God's desired result. And the later prophets, such as Jeremiah and Ezekiel, see God as having brought about the destruction of Jerusalem. Remember the story of Joseph and what he tells his brothers, right? He says, it was God's will that you did what you did to me, so that I would save lives, so that I would bring you here, etc. Right? Now, the problem with this view of history is that more often than not, history doesn't work out nice and clean. Right? History is brutal. So what kind of God would use an evil nation to carry out God's designs? So, at least in our time, we're stuck with the kind of history that is not divine, right? That produces evil, or at least at best, random results much of the time. To view every event in history as part of God's plan makes God complicit in some pretty despicable events, right? How gracious and compassionate would you believe God was if you believe that God had brought about the pandemic?
Well, I think that's why some people are atheists.
Or the Holocaust.
They look at people that are
Yeah.
super strict scriptural interpreters.
Or
and they say,
the
well,
Holocaust.
Or the
no,
Holocaust.
okay.
Mhm. The World Series. Ronnie, you're gonna stay late, okay? The pandemic, the Holocaust, and the World Series.
There's more Jews in
Yeah.
Atlanta than there are in Houston.
Yeah. So how are we supposed to think of God as gracious and compassionate with all of that other stuff? So I think that the idea of God acting in history only works in the following way. The prophets pull out all the stops in trying to get the people to change. They use all sorts of great poetry and visions of apocalypse and promises of redemption, along with, of course, condemning the behavior of the people, which is undesirable. It can't all be taken literally. One writer put it, says, did Isaiah really think that carnivorous animals like wolves or leopards would lie down with their prey? Okay? Or was he trying to say that one day nations might live together in peace? I also would not assume that Isaiah could foresee much beyond his own time. You know, he doesn't prophesy about the Romans. He doesn't prophesy about the Crusades or about the Holocaust. And we don't know what he would have said about those events. And further, in thinking about God's role in history, although I don't want to overuse this line of thinking, I accept that sometimes I just don't understand it, and I can't understand it. To borrow a verse from 2nd Isaiah, this is in chapter 55, but as the heavens are high above the earth, so are my ways high above your ways, and my plans above your plans. Now, you remember what God told Moses, right? God told Moses, you cannot see my face and live, right? In other words, there's a part of God that will always be mysterious from our perspective. And, you know, anyone who says, I can explain God, right? Treat them like your average televangelist, right? You know, God created heaven and earth. Well, explain that one too, right? From the view of the prophets, even though God is very angry because of the evils we commit, God's compassion overcomes the anger. If it doesn't, well, you know, who wants that God anyway, right? Now, even if we drop the idea that every agent in history is an instrument of God's will, we can still value Isaiah's message. We know that history is not always on the side of what is right. Sometimes the bad guys do win, right? That's the way it is. Maybe not forever. Maybe for a century, maybe for a few, right? Can happen. The fact that the temple was destroyed and the Jews went into exile doesn't mean that the principles Judaism stands for were wrong. And the other thing about it, which goes beyond those tragedies, is we survived. We survived. And sometimes we exist in defiance of history.
Absolutely.
Sometimes power isn't the only way to solve problems. You know, morality matters, even if it doesn't win wars. So when Isaiah tells Hezekiah not to trust in horses and chariots, maybe what he's saying is that even if you need them to win a war, horses and chariots are not enough. You know, back to Zechariah, right? Not by might, not by power, but by my spirit, says the Lord of hosts, right? Well, sometimes you need power, but without the Spirit of God, without the right values, power is amoral. And all those powers that Isaiah watched pass by, they passed by too. Hey, the Assyrians, they're gone. Babylonians, they're gone. The Persians, they're gone. Alexander the Great, gone. The Romans, gone. You know, so when will nations learn to live in peace? And whatever message they had, does it stand up to the message of Isaiah? I would argue it does not. Right? Whatever of value came out of those civilizations, I think, compares unfavorably to Isaiah. Yeah. Comments, questions? Yeah, please.
I guess it's stupid, but what is the answer about to where was God during the Holocaust?
Yeah. So I would say the answer is God was there in the camps. God cried together with his people. The problem is that we are sometimes wedded to the notion of an all-powerful God. We also believe that God gave human beings free will, which means they have the power to commit evil. So which one do you want? You can have human beings be puppets of God, and everybody does right and good, and we have no personality of our own, right? But that's not the world God created. You know, in this world, God has given up ultimate power and given power to human beings. And human beings can create great evil, and it's up to other human beings to stop them. You know, what happened? You know, it was clear in 1933 what was going to happen. And did anybody do anything about it? Well, you know, some of the Jews did. They left. They got out while the going was possible.
Some people
Although
tried
it
to
was
fight
very
back.
difficult.
And there were those who tried to fight
There were
back.
all kinds of groups that fought
But-
against the power.
Yeah, not enough, right? So when you put evil in power, guess what's gonna happen? Evil stuff. And God is not going to step in the way that we would like. You know, we would only like God to exercise his power judiciously, right? Like, you know, go easy on us on Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, right? You know, don't be that all powerful God. Don't give me that, you know, give me another break, right? Give me another excuse, shall we? You know, let me give you this note, which will be good for the coming year. And I'll pay it off in good deeds. And then we come back and say, well, we didn't do so good. We didn't pay off that note. Give us a bigger note. Yeah, Lou.
Even though God promised the land of Israel to Abraham's descendants, we had to fight for it. And a lot of people died on both sides of the battles.
That's for sure. That's for sure. Yeah, please.
As you said, the Babylonians are gone, the Persians are gone, well, now Iran. We've survived.
I would have
since
traded Iran for the Persians.
Yeah, since 69 AD or 70 AD, we've been, you know, until 1948. So that's like almost 2,000 years. So it is amazing that we have survived, even though thousands were killed in the, you know, thousands, probably more than that, were killed in the Crusades and the Spanish Inquisition and of course the Holocaust.
Pogroms.
It is amazing. So what is God trying to tell us? That all these other civilizations are no longer with us, and yet we survive. Why does he give us such horrors to have to deal with? Anti-Semitism still exists.
Yeah, I would
It's
say
rising.
that it is unfair to blame God for anti-Semitism. Right?
Well,
You know, God didn't plant hatred of Jews. No, people planted that. Right?
that is true.
Yeah. So, you know, why is it that those people hate Jews? Maybe it's because they hate what Judaism stands for as they see it,
Well,
which
not
may or may
acceptance of
not
Christ-
be the reality.
Not acceptance of Christianity.
Yeah, well, there's that. But there are lots of anti-Semites in lands where Christianity is not exactly strong. Yes, Ron.
At what point in history did God say, I'm no longer going to be involved? Because throughout the Torah, he gets involved.
Yes.
At what point?
It's very interesting you asked that. So I would refer you to a thinker by the name of Yitz Greenberg, who's an Orthodox rabbi. Yitz Greenberg says there were three stages of Jewish history. Okay, the first stage is, you know, through a certain point in the Bible where God is clearly in charge.
Yes.
And God's power manifests itself not every day, maybe, but here and there, right? You know, like, you know, Elijah pulls off this miracle, you know, where, you know, the fire on his altar, you know, it seems like the fire comes down from heaven, right? And the prophets of Baal don't get that. And so he wins the day. You know, seems like, to me, like Elijah must have invented lighter fluid. It's, I know it's cheap, but it's fun. Yeah.
It is fun.
So that's the first era of Jewish history. The second era of Jewish history is shared responsibility. God gives his children more responsibility because maybe that's what growing up is like, right? You grow up, you take responsibility for the world, okay? And so this is how it was, in the rabbinic period, where the notion of this partnership develops. And yes, there are miracles sometimes, but we don't necessarily depend on miracles, right? We expect, we're going to have to deal with reality, however good or bad it is, and we'll take the bull by the horns and deal with it. And now we are in what Greenberg calls the third era of Jewish history, where God has, like any good parent ultimately must do, God has backed off completely and said, okay, this is your world. It is your responsibility. I'm not here to fix it for you. I care. I mean, if you're a parent, you care if your kids are not doing their job, or if they are. If they are, you have nachas. If they're not, you're sad.
So
But
when
you
did that
can't do it
start?
for you.
When did that period start?
Well, not clear. I mean, he doesn't give like a fixed
Yeah, but
day and time.
approximately.
It was like noon on a Tuesday in 1923. I don't know. It's not that there's a clear demarcation for that. If you want, call it the Holocaust.
Okay.
All right.
No,
Yeah,
I'd say earlier.
you'd say earlier, and I wouldn't argue with you. Okay, but like I said, there's not a firm demarcation. But the third era of Jewish history is, look, guys, it's time to grow up. It's time to take care of the world that you have as it is, and not let evil people make a mess of it. Yes, Daniel.
There is a line of thought, and it's not clear to me, I'm asking a question, but that starts with the idea that creation and destruction are opposite sides of the same coin, that you can't have one without the other. And that what God's doing is allowing destruction in order that something else to be created. And applying that to the Holocaust, that without the Holocaust, there would have been no Israel.
There are people who have advanced that argument, but I think most people feel that that's a blasphemous argument. And I would agree.
6 million people is a lot of people.
Well, look, if you're talking about people who sacrificed their lives in a war for the Jewish people, the Holocaust didn't happen in order to make Israel possible. The Holocaust happened because evil people wanted to kill Jews. Well, that may be true, but to suggest that justifies God somehow, or justifies an all-powerful God, that stinks. And I don't buy it. Gotcha.
God says in every generation there's going to become somebody who's going to go after the Jews, right?
Yes, the whole door of it.
And so far, he's never been wrong,
Yeah, it's true,
right?
right?
But how many people pay attention to that line?
Well, a lot of Jews do apparently, because they understand that. And they understand that, you have to stand up against anti-Semitism. Okay? You don't just back away. Yeah.
So why did God make Jews such a small minority of the world's population? Couldn't even give us even 1 or 2%, we have like point something. Couldn't give us 1 or 2% or 5% or 10%.
Yeah.
Is that a suggestion?
I don't have a simple answer to that, Bob. I wish I did. It would be, yeah, on the surface, I think it would have been nice if God had given us just enough people to where we would be like a solid voting bloc
Exactly.
Right.
in a lot of countries.
They had to pay attention to them.
Yeah, people would have to pay attention. They would be
Aside from
respected.
the money
Yeah.
factor.
Yeah, and not just, like the Hasidim in Brooklyn, right? Where every city council member in Brooklyn has to pay attention to that block, right? It'd be nice. God has not informed me about why that was the way things were set
Well,
up.
if there was an
But I
equivalent,
think the other, the part of the answer is that if it had not been for all the Jews who were killed due to pogroms, Holocaust, the expulsion from Spain, which had very brutal results. It's
Yeah.
not just like they all
Right,
moved. A lot of people died
right.
trying to get out or were victims of forced conversions, right? Et cetera, et cetera. If it had not been for all those people who died, we would be a pretty substantial block.
Yeah.
plus the 6 million.
Yeah,
What about-
plus 6 million and their descendants. Yeah. So that's the only answer I can offer. Right? If we had been able to prevent that, we would definitely be a much more substantial block.
So the Orthodox today, including Chabad, but not just Chabad, are trying to reproduce in much greater numbers, whereas most Reform Jews and many conservative Jews, including myself, I have to admit, are not producing or have assimilated. And their offspring is going to be lost, mostly.
I think that's, probably the biggest challenge that we face, which is how to raise Jews and raise awareness in Jewish communities that there is something special and sacred and necessary about the Jewish people, right? And if we don't convince people of that, then yeah, we will, our continuity will be left up to the Orthodox, right? Now, that's not all bad, right? I think in 100 years, if the Jews in 100 years were only the descendants of Orthodox Jews today, right? They still wouldn't all be Orthodox.
No, they'd
No.
Right.
be great
Because look how many people are, in conservative synagogues are the children of Orthodox Jews.
They'd be branching. They would branch off later on.
And maybe create new branches,
Yeah.
which
Yeah.
didn't exist before, right?
We are branching
And
off.
look, I certainly have not given up on conservative Judaism. I'm not convinced that Reform Judaism is going to survive other than through, assimilating people who continue to move left from Orthodox and conservative. But I think that conservative Judaism still has a lot to say for itself. The problem with conservative Judaism is people don't keep it. Right? If 20%, that's a big number, 20% of the members of Beth Yeshurun would A, make Kiddush on Friday night, B, come to synagogue for at least half the service on Saturday morning,
Be swamped.
C, would observe at least some of the laws of kashrut. Right?
You'd be swamped.
We'd be very busy here. And D, would come to our Sunday morning classes.
You'd be swamped.
need a bigger board, right?
You can go to another room. That's not a problem.
We- Yes.
Do you know how many people are watching?
Jennifer, do we know how many people watch the reruns?
I haven't checked in a while, but there were 10, 20, 30 people on given weeks. It may have tapered off to the folks who are really sort of
Double what's
sticking with
here.
it. But you mean the classes?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's some like 10, 20 folks who kind of settled in and decided to stick to
Okay,
classes.
Yeah.
Is that all the classes or this one?
I haven't monitored all, well, we only have a
Oh, look
few that
at
we're
that,
putting
Jerry.
online, but this, he has three.
Yeah,
of
you
them, so.
have it.
Yeah.
So what's
Yeah.
the part of cost that if somebody was gonna pick part of it, you'd say was?
I would say don't eat tray.
Yeah.
You know,
That's the
when you
biggest-
go out to a restaurant, you don't eat something that's by definition tray.
that's the big-
Lot trade.
Yeah.
Rabbi,
You see, you know, I do this because I believe there's something in it and that there's something meaningful about the mitzvot. And I believe that, you know, in some crazy way, God wants me to maintain this way of life. And I'm not prepared to go 100%, but I'll go. I'll go at least a little bit of the way. And I'll educate my children about it so that they can make intelligent choices about how far they want to go.
Rabbi, do you know what percentage of marriages that the shul is doing?
No, I don't, because I don't get asked to do it.
Rabbi Rose was doing a talk, I think, probably 2 years ago. And he was saying that the number of marriages have fallen. They're only doing about 20% of the marriages that they used to.
Uh-huh. Yeah, so in marriage has fallen, which, you know, duh, you know,
In marriage?
I'm sorry,
What was the term you used? In marriage?
in marriage, meaning marriage between Jew and Jew. Right, why do you think, you know, we're not doing as many marriages? It's because we won't do intermarriages,
Right.
right? So we all know that the rate of intermarriage has gone up
Like 50%?
considerably,
Yeah.
right? And that's something else that we live with, right? So numbers of Jews in conservative synagogues, even Beth Yeshurun, will shrink in the next couple of decades, right? Now, my hope is, I mean, I don't expect or believe that that will change over the next couple of decades. I don't think there's anything we could do today about that. What we have to do is build for the more core committed conservative Jews, the people who are going to buy into that program that I just described, with you know, at least some core principles. That would make for a much tighter movement, and therefore a movement which would sustain itself and not see people, you know, drifting to reform because their children are going to reform.
Why do you say that you think there's nothing that can be done to change the statistics in that?
Well, because it's too late to tell people who are getting married at the age of 30 and 35, you know, they've already had whatever education we're going to give them. We don't have a way to grab those people and say, are you crazy? Look what you're doing. You are neglecting the faith of our ancestors. 4,000 years of Judaism went into making you, and you're throwing that away because, you know, you're not going to raise Jewish children. You're not going to live a Jewish life.
Right.
Okay.
But it's not just people that are married and choosing to get, I mean, it's people that just don't want to be affiliated too.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
Why do you think that is? Like, what's the big? So I can't identify with that. Some Horwitz. I chose this.
Yeah.
It's called assimilation.
Well, it is. But what does assimilation mean? Look, you know,
The loss of interest in Judaism.
it is not just a loss of interest in Judaism. I would say that for many people, they never really got a vision of Judaism, at its best.
I would
Okay.
agree with you.
And let me give you an example. Okay, I was part of a youth group, synagogue youth group, which we do not have at Beth Yeshurun, by the way, but nonetheless, I was part of a youth group, and it just so happened that the cool kids in the youth group were the ones who were most secure with their Jewish identity and with practicing Judaism. Right? And
That wasn't
so
you.
I said to
That
myself,
wasn't you, was it? At that time,
Definitely
at that
not.
time.
I was not one of the cool
At that
kids,
time.
especially when I was like 14, 15, you would not have wanted to know. And I'm not gonna tell. So, but I saw a vision within that program of what an observant Jewish life could look like. And so I said, what are the things that I can do at this? I'm, 15, 16 years old, okay? And I came from a totally non-observant home, okay? It would not be too far off to say that I came from the kind of home where they ate pork on Yom Kippur. Okay. Whether it was that, they didn't make a point of that, but you get the idea. But I got a vision, because ironically, my parents belonged to the conservative synagogue. Why? Because you couldn't be a Zionist if you belonged to the Reform Temple. That's interesting. Right? In the Reform Temple in Oklahoma City, you could not use the word Israel, referring to the state of Israel, until after 1967.
Wow.
They were part of the American Council for Judaism, which was like Beth Israel here at that time, totally anti-Zionist. Okay?
Not today.
Why were they
That's why
anti-Zionist?
Because we are Americans.
Military.
Yeah, we're Jews, but we are Americans. Not that their Judaism had any content particularly. Yeah, so anyway, the bottom line is, out of that and out of other experiences I had as I continued to mature, thank God, I got a vision of what Jewish life would be like and how it would be meaningful, and I bought into that.
Did that change your parents' level of observance at all?
No. Well, first of all, my father died when I was very young, okay? And my mother's a whole different case, all right? No, did not change her, for her, it was, for me to become a rabbi was like, it was very traumatic for her because she had had nothing but bad experiences with rabbis. If the only time you see the rabbi is when your kid has done something wrong, or when you're in the hospital, or somebody died and he's running a funeral, right? Well, you don't necessarily want to see the rabbi that much. Yeah, it's not like the rabbi created the relationship, or for that matter, that she was interested in a relationship. It was just, but I got a different view of things because I had certain experiences through youth group, through working at Jewish camp, although I was never a camper, right? Because couldn't afford it. And then through college age youth group, and then working for the conservative movement, and then learning.
It's interesting that they sent you to a Jewish camp if they were.
They didn't send me to a Jewish camp. My mother didn't have the money to send me to a camp. So even if that would have been, worthwhile, it would have been basically to exile me, right? if she could have afforded. But when I was in college, I worked a couple of summers at Camp Ramah. Two of them. the second year was Kempermont, New England, and the first year was at Glen Spey, which was sold after that year because they condemned the dining room and they didn't have it. And I worked in that dining room. Okay, so this is way too much of my story, but the point is that, if we have a program for the next generation, it has to be able to show them what a serious Jewish community looks like, and why they should buy into it.
Could we do that here?
Well, we could if the will to do it was here.
Rabbi,
Yes.
how about, maybe there is something like this going on now. Is there a way that Beth Yeshurun and other conservative synagogues could try to get Jewish children from outside their membership into the Jewish schools, maybe financial assistance, to get more Jewish kids out of public school, which are horrible, and into Jewish day schools? The only way I can think of is like financial aid.
Well, that is happening, but let me tell you that it's not the full solution.
No, not the full-
Because the Jewish day school is not always a beacon for Jewish life. All right? As an example, all right? Emory Weiner is touted as the big community Jewish school. All right? They also play sports on Shabbat.
They do?
They do.
Really?
And that tells you
Oh, I didn't know.
where they come from
Very-
as far as,
Not only do they play it, they host a tournament. I spent all Saturday there with my child.
I was thinking about Beth Yeshurun day school.
yeah,
Here-
so
Oh,
So that's
I
not
didn't know that.
a school that has a vision of what Shabbat can mean to young Jews.
You're right, because the only other alternative is the Orthodox school. There is
Well,
not-
yes,
Yeah.
and when we came here, we looked at the schools and we found out all about the schools,
Yes, sir.
and our kids went to Barron.
Yeah.
It was much easier for me to
They went where?
justify sending our kids to the Barron Academy
Sure.
as conservative Jews, and we were not the only conservative Jews at Barron,
Mhm.
right? Plus, remember, there are a lot of closet conservative Jews in the Orthodox community.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, they go to the Orthodox synagogue because it provides the kind of community that they don't see in the conservative synagogues. Right? And that's just the way it is. But, sometimes we would have little conversations over dinner about certain things the kids had picked up at Barron. My son was already, he was already a junior in high school, and he had other issues as well. And my daughter was, going into 5th grade when she came here. So, we would have little conversations about, how do you feel about that? Do you believe that X, Y, and Z? And so we would say, yeah, and it's a great thing to learn all the things you are learning at Barron Academy. It is very text oriented. You want to learn the Bible, learn the Bible, learn the prophets. All right, they don't teach that much prophets, okay, but you get the idea. When it taught certain things about, this is what Judaism is, and we didn't necessarily agree with that. So we would have a conversation about that. Ultimately, it's going to be our kids' decision as to what kind of lives they want to live. Well, so fine.
When did the shift come? Because my kids went to Iweiner and there was nothing on Saturday, but they're, much, much older.
That is not true.
There was never anything on Saturday because Byron.
You didn't see it, but it wasn't, but it's not true. It happened. It was true in the founding of the school. And I will tell you, we're late, sorry.
It's okay.
But this is one story I'll share with everybody in this room, okay? And you can share it with anyone you want. A number of years ago, I ran into an old friend online who was a Jewish educator. And he was a nice guy, and I had known him back in another life. And he asked me where I was. We hadn't probably seen each other in a long, long time. And I said, I was in Houston there. And he said, I know a little bit about Houston. I applied to be the founding head of school at Iweiner. Right? And I said, well, that's interesting. How'd that work out? You didn't take it. He said, well, no, they didn't offer it to me. I was, however, the lead candidate. Right? I said, so why didn't they offer it to you? He said, because at a certain point, they threw out all the candidates and went back to the drawing board. And why did they do that? Because the donor, the founding donor, insisted that there be sports on Shabbat, and none of the candidates were willing to accept that.
At Iweiner.
Which is now Emory Weiner, basically.
Yeah.
I don't remember.
Do you think that?
Now, I cannot swear that this is actually what happened. It is what I was told by somebody who was in a position to know.
My guess is that Emory would think, for example, that if we didn't have the sports on Shabbat, that we would really lose our kids. They'd really leave Judaism. It's like this is a compromise sort of that we need to sort of let them do.
Well, to me, that's like saying that we should all have Christmas trees because otherwise we'll lose our Jews. Our children will want to be like the world.
Having a Christmas tree in your home does not violate anything in the Jewish law. I'm not advocating it. I'm not advocating.
I would argue with that.
Specifically say-
Idolatry.
Whether it's idolatry or not is not. Not acceptable.
Rabbi, like going on the egg hunt on Easter.
Rabbi Strail said, go out for Halloween. I mean,
Oh, that really.
if the kid knocks on my door, I'll give him candy. But I would say,